So here's Sarah making a big fuss over the baby, and then suddenly she says, "Oh Lord, Lydia's turned callow as a rat." Lydia came to have a look at the baby. The baby did not look well. She said, "Well, what have you given him?" "Oh, just gave it a bit of sugar." She snatched the baby back. Well, Sarah left, and poor little Solomon was unwell for several days, but he eventually recovered. Sarah bombarded Lydia with demands to come and see her. Well, eventually, Lydia, against her better judgment, agreed, but she kept Solomon firmly in her arms. Sarah Chesham said, "Oh look, out of that window, I can see Thomas. I'm going to take the baby to see its father." She snatched the baby out of Lydia's arms and rushed down the stairs and out the house. Lydia rushed after her. When she caught up with her, she saw again that Sarah had put something into the baby's mouth. She snatched the baby back. Little Solomon, very ill again. 3 weeks, eventually, he recovered. Well, as soon as he was weaned, Lydia went back into service again with a doctor in Stansted, leaving Solomon in charge of her mother. The day after, Sarah Chesham was back. Mrs. Taylor knew to avoid her. She was terrified of the woman. So she took the baby and she left the house. And Sarah ran after her in the street and grabbed the baby out of her arms and ran off round a corner, and poor lady was running after her. When she caught up with her, again she saw her putting something in the baby's mouth, snatched the baby back. Well, from then on, little Solomon was a very, very unwell little baby indeed, and he was finding it difficult to absorb food into his system and started to waste away. Well, in the meantime, Thomas Newport had stopped giving support money completely, and so the Taylors, very unusually, decided to challenge this rich, powerful family, and they went to the Saffron Walden Petty Sessions and got an order made for the magistrates for support. But they did one other thing, and this was really explosive. Mrs. Taylor put in a paper there saying that there had been a conspiracy between Sarah Chesham and Thomas Newport to murder Solomon. And that they handed in, and that really set things going. Sarah was questioned by the police, her house was searched, and she was actually put in Springfield jail. Well, while the inquiries were going on, this actually made people think back to January of 1845. Sarah had 2 sons, aged 8 and 10, and they died. And the death had been put down to cholera, even though it was not the season for cholera. People started to think, what if she poisoned them? So they exhumed bodies. I'm sorry, this is very gruesome. You're just going to have to come for talk on murder. It gets worse. And the stomachs were sent for analysis by a very, very eminent man, Professor Alfred Swain Taylor. And there was an inquest held. Now, nobody had better reason to remember the events of January 1845 than a man called Thomas Deards. He was a painter. And Sarah Chesham and her family lived in one of these divided cottages that I mentioned. Chesham's in one side, Mr. Deards and his family in the other side. Deards had a living room downstairs, and it was actually directly below the bedroom, which sort of was one part of the Chesham part of the house, which was above there. And he remembered very well the 2 little boys being very ill in bed and being sick. And there was no carpet on the floor above. Are you getting the pictures to him sitting at his dining table, and it was all dripping down onto his table? So he was very upset about this, as you can well imagine, so he rushed out and hammered on the Chesham's door. There was no answer. He was very surprised, but he went about his business, and to his horror found Sarah in the street. And he went up to her. He said, "Your children are very ill. You should go and attend to them." And she said, "Oh, all right." He went about his business. He comes back some time later. She's still out in the street. He went up to her again. He said, "Have you not been for a doctor for these children?" She seemed not to care. Well, nothing really happened until later that evening when her husband came home He saw how ill the two boys were, and he went to the doctor, who fobbed him off with a bottle of medicine. And, well, by then it was pretty much too late, and the two boys eventually died. Now, at this resumed inquest, it was found that both the boys had been poisoned with arsenic, but no arsenic was found anywhere in the Chesham's house. There was one person who could have got arsenic as much as he liked, Thomas Newport. It was used for agricultural purposes. There was huge suspicion, obviously, against Sarah Chesham, but really there was very little proof. And then eventually, of course, little Solomon Taylor, he too passed away. Very difficult to arrive at the cause of death in this case. But the inquest on the other two boys concluded that they had been poisoned by their mother. She was clapped up in jail. Thomas Newport was accused of being an accessory. He, of course, being very rich, was able to pay a substantial sum and get out on bail. She was stuck in prison, and while she was there, she wrote a long letter accusing him of having done the poisoning. It was another one of her specialities, was blaming things on other people. Well, she finally stood trial for the murder of the two boys. No one had seen her give the poison, nothing had been found in her house. Evidence given that she was a devoted mother. She was acquitted. There followed a trial for the murder of little Solomon. Well, she had been seen administering something, but nobody knew what it was, and no cause of death could be arrived at. She was acquitted of that as well. Thomas Newport was never tried. Newport was taken to court by the Taylors, accusing him of trying to make Lydia have an abortion. Remember, he was trying to give her that medicine. Her word against his. He was a rich man. He was acquitted. So Sarah Chesham went back to Clavering, and she now had a new nickname. She was called Sally Arsenic. Her fame spread throughout the county. She gave advice to women on how to get rid of unwanted husbands. There was a lady called Mary May, in a place called Wicks. She was actually hanged for poisoning her brother-in-law after insuring him. And she said that she confessed that she'd been inspired by Sarah Chesham's example. Well, one of the people who always believed that Sarah was innocent was her husband. In December 1849, he became rather ill. He remained ill for some months. The doctor was baffled. He couldn't imagine what it might be. And eventually, after 3 months of illness, he died. But the analysis showed that he had a very irritated stomach, and it was believed that he had been poisoned with arsenic. Once again, they searched Sarah Chesham's cottage. No sign of anything. Until the police picked up a bag of rice and said, "We'll take this away for analysis." And she said, "No, it doesn't belong to me, don't take it." Right. They took it away. And they analysed it. And guess what? Nestling amongst those little grains of white rice were little grains of white arsenic. That was what she'd been using to make the milk puddings for her husband. Now, Sarah had actually learned from experience, instead of giving a massive dose of arsenic, she'd been giving lots of little ones, which is why her husband had taken so long to die. So, Professor Taylor, under the abilities that they had at the day, was really not able to say precisely what the cause of death was. It was actually looking as though she was going to get away with it again. And then someone suggested, well, okay, in the inquest jury, they might not be willing to say, because in those days inquest juries came up with an actual verdict against the person, they might not be able to come up with a verdict of murder. Would they be willing to come up with a verdict of attempted murder? Yes, that they would do. So she was arrested again. And she was tried, and there was a new witness, a lady called Hannah Phillips, who was a neighbour. And she'd been rather overconfident, and she'd been sort of boasting to Hannah, saying, "Well, if you want to get rid of your husband, I can show you a few tips. I can show you how to season a pie. You won't be troubled with him anymore." So she had actually told Hannah that Thomas Newport had given her poison to poison not only little Solomon, but poison Lydia as well. And she also explained why they couldn't find poison in the house. She'd actually hidden it under a stump of a tree. So, Sarah was found guilty of attempted murder. And it so happened, at that time, the penalty for attempted murder was death. So it made no difference, actually, as to whether she was murdered or not. And she was indeed hanged at Springfield jail in front of a large and probably appreciative crowd. But the interesting thing is, of course, convicted murderers were usually buried in the precincts of the jail, but she wasn't convicted of murder, she was convicted of attempted murder. So that rule didn't apply. So her eldest son, and she did have one or two left, came up with a horse and a cart, and the coffin was loaded on the cart, took it back home, brought it into the house, onto the table, took off the lid, there she was, still pinioned and rope around her neck, and all the neighbours came in and had a jolly good look. As I always say, there was nothing on television in those days. You had to make your own entertainment. Now, this case actually caused a national scandal. People just go and buy white arsenic. So what actually happened was they brought in a new law precisely because of this case. That arsenic, first of all, had to be mixed with something, a colourant, so you couldn't just mix it with rice. And also people had to sign a poison book when they bought it. Now you might ask what happened to Thomas Newport. Well, I'm sorry to say he didn't get his comeuppance. He left Clavering. We went to manage a farm. He got married, raised a family. He employed young female servants, I'm sorry to say, and he eventually died at a ripe old age, a very wealthy man, so that ain't no justice.